What if the biggest threat to Keir Starmer isn't the opposition, the economy, or even public opinion, but the return of a political figure many thought belonged to the past? Because right now, a controversy linked to Peter Mandelson is quietly growing into something much bigger than a simple political story. It is raising questions about influence, transparency, and whether anything in British politics has truly changed. And more importantly, it is forcing people to ask a difficult question: who is really shaping the future of the Labour Party? Because if this continues, it won't just be a minor controversy. It could redefine how Starmer is perceived, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of whether political systems can actually renew themselves. Here is what happened in a nutshell. Starmer made a high-risk political appointment because he wanted a heavyweight operator in Washington who could handle a second Donald Trump administration. Due diligence already warned of reputational risk. Security vetters then recommended denial. That recommendation was overridden, and Mandelson still took office and was prepared for the job while clearance issues were unresolved. Deeper Epstein revelations later got him sacked, and the cover-up versus competence question then engulfed Starmer. To understand why this situation matters, we first need to understand the role Peter Mandelson has played in British politics. Peter Mandelson is not simply a former politician. He is widely considered one of the key architects behind the transformation of Labour in the 1990s. Working closely with Tony Blair, Mandelson helped design what became known as New Labour, a strategic shift that fundamentally redefined the party. At the time, Labour had spent years struggling to win elections. It was perceived as too ideological, too disconnected from the economic realities of the country, and unable to appeal to a broad electorate. Mandelson's approach was different. Instead of trying to reinforce Labour's traditional identity, he helped reshape it. The party moved toward the political center, embraced market-friendly policies, and actively built relationships with business leaders, media institutions, and international partners. This was not just a policy shift, it was a structural transformation. Labour became electable again, and the results were immediate. The 1997 election delivered a landslide victory, ending nearly 2 decades of Conservative rule and establishing Labour as the dominant political force in the UK for years. But this success came with consequences, because the model that Mandelson helped build relied heavily on networks of influence. Political decision-making became closely connected with media strategy, business relationships, and centralized control. To supporters, this was simply effective governance. To critics, it was something else entirely. It looked like a system where power was concentrated, managed behind the scenes, and often disconnected from the broader public. And over time, that perception began to shape Mandelson's reputation. Peter Mandelson was not some random diplomat who embarrassed the government. He was Starmer's hand-picked ambassador to Washington, brought in for one of the most sensitive jobs in British diplomacy. And now that choice has turned into a full-blown argument about vetting, judgment, transparency, and whether Parliament got the full truth. Mandelson's career has always been marked by both influence and controversy. He resigned from government twice. First in 1998 and again in 2001, over issues related to financial disclosures and questions surrounding his connections to wealthy individuals. These incidents were not unique in the world of politics, but they reinforced a broader narrative that Mandelson operated within elite networks where political power, personal relationships, and business interests overlapped. After leaving frontline politics, he did not disappear. Instead, he transitioned into international roles, including serving as a European commissioner, and later moved into the private sector. Throughout all of this, one thing remained constant: his proximity to power. Even outside formal government roles, Mandelson continued to be seen as someone who understood how influence works at the highest levels, someone who could navigate the intersection of politics, economics, and strategy, and importantly, someone who never fully lost his connections. That is why his reappearance in the current political conversation matters, because he is not just another advisor. He represents an entire era of political thinking. When Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, he inherited a deeply divided political organization. The period under Jeremy Corbyn had energized parts of the electorate, but it had also created significant internal conflict and damaged Labour's broader appeal among moderate voters. Starmer's mission was clear. He needed to stabilize the party, rebuild trust with the public, and position Labour as a credible alternative government. His approach was methodical. He emphasized professionalism, discipline, and policy clarity. He reduced internal conflict, he moved the party toward the center, and he focused on presenting Labour as competent and reliable. This strategy has been effective in many ways. Labour's polling improved. The party regained credibility with key voter groups, and Starmer established himself as a serious political figure. But this approach also has a vulnerability. It depends heavily on perception. Starmer is not relying on charisma or ideological momentum. He is relying on trust, on the idea that he represents something stable, measured, and different from the chaos that voters have experienced in recent years. And that is where Mandelson becomes a problem. Recent reports and political analysis suggest that Mandelson has been involved directly or indirectly in shaping aspects of Labour's strategy. This includes advisory roles, strategic input, and connections with business and financial communities. In isolation, this is not unusual. Experienced political figures often return to provide guidance. Parties frequently rely on individuals with deep institutional knowledge. But politics today is not just about what happens behind closed doors. It is about perception. And the perception here is powerful, because Mandelson is not a neutral figure. He is strongly associated with a specific model of politics, a model that many voters view with skepticism. So when his influence becomes visible, even indirectly, it triggers a broader reaction. It raises questions about whether Labour has truly changed, whether the party is moving forward, or whether it is returning to a familiar structure. This is particularly sensitive because of the current political climate. Trust in institutions is already fragile. Voters are more aware of political networks, more skeptical of elite influence, and more critical of perceived lack of transparency. In that environment, even limited involvement from a figure like Mandelson can have an outsized impact. Controversy is not just coming from outside Labour, it is also emerging from within the party itself. There are factions within Labour that have long been critical of the new Labour model. They see it as overly centralized, too aligned with business interests, and disconnected from grassroots concerns. For these groups, Mandelson's reappearance is not surprising, but it is concerning. It reinforces their belief that the party is returning to a structure they fundamentally disagree with. This creates internal tension, because Starmer is trying to maintain a broad coalition. He needs support from moderate voters, but he also needs to keep the party unified, and those goals are not always compatible. The more visible Mandelson's influence becomes, the harder it is for Starmer to manage that balance, because it forces a conversation that he would likely prefer to avoid. A conversation about identity, about direction, and about who really holds influence within the party. For Starmer, the biggest risk is not necessarily what Mandelson is doing, but what his involvement represents, because political narratives are rarely based purely on fact. They are shaped by perception, and right now, that Labour is reconnecting with its past, that the same networks are re-emerging, and that the promise of change may not be as strong as it appeared. This matters because Starmer's leadership is built on credibility. He is presenting himself as a steady, trustworthy alternative. But credibility is fragile. Once doubts begin to form, they can spread quickly, especially in a media environment where narratives can develop rapidly. Even if Mandelson's role is limited, the symbolism is significant, and in politics, symbolism often matters more than substance. This situation is not unique to the UK. It reflects a broader pattern seen across many democratic systems. Political elites often do not disappear. They evolve, they shift roles, they move between public office, private sector, and advisory positions, and in doing so, they maintain influence. This creates a perception of continuity, of a system where power circulates rather than changes, and that perception contributes to declining trust, because voters begin to feel that political outcomes are shaped by the same individuals, regardless of elections. Mandelson fits into this pattern. He represents a type of political actor who remains influential over time, and that is why his involvement resonates beyond the immediate situation. It connects to a larger question about how power operates. Looking forward, there are two main potential scenarios. The first is containment. Starmer keeps Mandelson's role informal and out of public view. The controversy gradually fades, and the focus shifts back to policy and electoral strategy. The second is escalation. More information emerges. Media coverage intensifies. Internal divisions become more visible, and the issue becomes central to how voters perceive Labour. The outcome will depend on how the situation is managed. But one thing is clear. Once a narrative like this takes hold, it is difficult to control. At its core, this is not just a story about Peter Mandelson, and it is not just a challenge for Keir Starmer. It is a reflection of a deeper issue within modern politics, the tension between change and continuity, between new leadership and old influence, and between what political systems promise and how they actually operate. Because in the end, the real question is not whether Mandelson is involved, it is whether his presence changes how people see the system itself. And if it does, then this is not just a temporary controversy. It is a test of whether political renewal is genuinely possible, or whether the past continues to shape the future, no matter who is in charge.